Hello, everybody. Again, glad to have you tonight on our monthly book talk. Tonight, we're going to be talking with Professor Thomas A. Guglielmo, who is a professor at George Washington University and has just written a book called Divisions about the Army and, the military in general. The book came out in September of 2021, and we grabbed him right away and put him on our books because we wanted to make sure we covered this. And Tom is Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of American Studies at George Washington University. Also the author of White on Arrival, Italians, Race, Color, and Power in Chicago, 1890 to 1940, which was also published by Oxford in 2003. And that book won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award of the Organization of American Historians. So I want to make sure I have introduced him, and welcome, Tom. We're glad you're with us. Have a very good evening to you.
Thanks so much.
Great. Glad to have you. Folks, once again, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. But I'm going to start off with a quick and easy question for Tom about the book and let him go from there, which is, how did you come to write about divisions? How did this subject attract you, and what drove you to tell this very interesting and much needed story that has to be told?
Well, thanks, John, for having me, and thanks to everyone at the museum for organizing this behind the scenes, and thanks to everyone out there. Can't see you, but I appreciate you being here tonight to hear me speak. So, you mentioned that first book about Italian immigrants in Chicago. You wouldn't think that'd have anything to do with World War II, the World War II military. But, when I was finishing that project, I spent a few weeks in Washington, D.C., where I'm living now, going to the National Archives and looking at federal records. And just came across this incredible wealth of material, kind of, gold mine for a social historian, someone who's really interested in on the ground lives. And I just instantly realized that a book about World War II in particular would be really, really interesting. And so the original project was race in World War II broadly, not just focused on the military. But, as I started writing, the chapter initially, there were supposed to be 2 chapters on the military during the war, and 2 became 4, became 6, became 8, finally 9. And I realized that, this what initially was a piece of the story is now the only story. And I just came to recognize just how important it was to wartime America, both, military folks and civilian folks as well. So you're going to hear about Winfred Lynn. I'm not going to say anything about him, but I just wanted you to see a picture of Winfred Lynn. I would imagine no one has heard about him unless you've read the book. He's not very well known, but he's a really inspiring person and has a really interesting World War II story. So I'll tell you more about Winfred Lynn in a bit. This is Yasugo Kodomiya, also someone that you probably have never heard of. This happens to be my wife's grandfather, and he served in the Army during World War II, and you're gonna hear a little bit about his story as well. Just 2 more quick slides. The Union for Democratic Action. This is a petition from the summer of 1942. And you can see that it's addressed to President Roosevelt I'm gonna have to get close because I don't have my glasses on. In the name of the democracy and freedom we are fighting to defend, we respectfully urge you to take immediate steps to eliminate the discrimination which still exists in our armed forces. Some slight improvements have already been made, but segregation is still the rule and discrimination is still rampant. And they give a couple examples, and this is just one example of some of the activism happening in the United States revolving around discrimination in the military. And then finally, here's a pamphlet that the Young Communist League was distributing in the fall of 1942 for a stronger blow at the Axis. They wanted a mixed regiment, more power for America. And by mixed regiment, they wanted They wanted a military unit, an army unit, in this case, a regiment that would allow people to volunteer to join, to serve in this regiment, and they wanted it to be integrated. So this was something that was a really interesting campaign during the war. It was just to give you a few visuals. Okay. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to talk about this book, Divisions. It came out last year, as John said. It's a long book. It's a complicated book, but I'm going to try to make it, I'm going to try to kind of break it down in the next 40 minutes or so. And I want to, talk about it in 3 parts. So the first part will involve racism, is entitled Racism. The second part is entitled Resistance. And the third part is entitled Aftermaths. So let's start with resistance. So America's World War II military was a force of unalloyed good, and not simply because it helped save the world from Nazism and totalitarianism. It also managed to unify a famously fractious American people. At least that's the good war story many of us have long told ourselves from the early days of war mobilization right up until the present day. So, for example, FDR in 1940, when he signed America's first peacetime draft, here's what he had to say. He made a prediction about how military service would shape social relations in the US. He said, "In the military service, Americans from all walks of life will learn to live side by side, to depend upon each other in military drills and maneuvers, and to appreciate each other's dignity as American citizens. Universal service will bring not only greater preparedness to meet the threat of war, but a wider distribution of tolerance and understanding to enjoy the blessings of peace." End of quote. So that's FDR in 1940, fall of 1940, when he signs the Selective Training and Service Act. By war's end, if pop culture could be believed, then this prediction had absolutely come true. Hollywood combat films and popular books, I'm sure you've seen a few of these, showcased a seemingly limitless supply of pleasantly plural platoons. Many, and this is a quote, quite consciously composed of one Negro, one Jew, a Southern boy, and a sprinkling of second-generation Italians, Irish, Scandinavians, and Poles. A balm against recurrent fears of a polarized nation, these stories about the adhesive powers of military service, the way in which military service could bind us together, these stories lived on in the post-war years. In 1998, The Greatest Generation, Tom Brokaw's bestseller from 1998, Brokaw assured his readers that America's World War II GIs, quote, were fused by a common mission and a common ethos, which was so uniformly profound that more than half a century later, they still all love each other. Completed 6 years later, the World War II Memorial, just blocks from where I'm seated right here in my office. The World War II Memorial, according to its website, quote, stands as an important symbol of American national unity, a timeless reminder of the moral strength and awesome power that can flow when a free people are at once united and bonded together in a common and just cause. So this is the conventional wisdom about the war. And my book, as the title suggests, tells a decidedly different story. It stresses not national unities, but racist divisions as a fundamental feature of America's World War II military and of the post-war world it helped to fashion. Who served? Who fought? Who died? Who gave orders and who was forced to follow them? Who received the best ratings and jobs and pay and promotions? Who was court-martialed? Who received furloughs and leaves? Who received honorable or dishonorable discharges? Who ate at the officers' club? Who danced at the post's main recreation center? Who drank at the best pub in Cherbourg, France, or swam at the nicest pool in Calcutta? Shaping every imaginable aspect of military life, color lines often spoke definitively in all these matters and more. So what did they say exactly? If these color lines spoke definitively across all these various areas, what did they have to say? The most fundamental answer, I would argue, is white supremacy. The US military was a sprawling structure of white domination. And I'll be specific here, because it sounds like this is kind of polemical, but it's not. It's rooted in years and years of research. What I mean when I say that the US military was a sprawling structure of white domination, I mean that the US military offered a grossly disproportionate share of power and prestige to those who could claim status as white. In comparison to all other people, whites had a much easier time joining the military or a particular branch or service in the military. They had a much easier time breaking into the officers' rank and rising within those ranks. They had a much easier time occupying all the highest positions of authority in the military. They had a much easier time receiving skilled, well-paid work and promotions. They had a much easier time enjoying adequate recreational facilities, a much easier time fighting in combat and receiving the honors that came along with it. They had a much easier time getting a fair shake in the military's criminal justice system, earning awards and decorations, and being discharged honorably, on time, and with access to invaluable GI Bill benefits. So white people enjoyed countless unearned advantages in the wartime military, but who were these white people exactly? And in relation to whom did they enjoy these advantages? Now, the answer to that question is really complicated, since the military had multiple crisscrossing color lines, not just a single one. These lines, and this is going to get a little technical, but it's very important. These lines defined white people and everyone else in various and sometimes contradictory ways. The military's most important racist division split what was called colored at the time from white, or in today's terms, black from white. Now, this category of colored included anyone who was, quote, Negro or part Negro. That is, anyone who had any discernible trace of Negro ancestry. But the all-important white category, as it turns out, was a moving target. At its most inclusive, whiteness corralled everyone not black, creating what some scholars today call a black, non-black line. In these cases, the power of the black-white line trumped, blurred, and even dissolved some other color lines. The black-white line sometimes transformed, that is, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, most Puerto Ricans and others into white insiders of a sort. For example, one 1940 War Department memo regarding who would be able to join white military outfits said this, quote, trainees of all races other than Negro will be assigned the same as white trainees, end of quote. But note the language in this memo. What it said was some of those, quote, races other than Negro, it suggested that they were not exactly white, but they would be assigned to outfits as if they were white. And so here then is a sign that the military established additional color lines beyond the black-white one. Now, the most important of these other lines were various versions of a white, non-white line. This color line was less widespread and less institutionalized than the black-white line, but at times it nonetheless narrowed the category of white to include, at its most exclusive, only those people of supposed pure European descent. So you have a line that seems to suggest that some Asian Americans and Latin Americans and American Indians are white, and then you have this other set of lines that suggests they're not. So this complexity meant that groups like Asian Americans, Latin Americans, and Native Americans zigged and zagged between whiteness, non-whiteness, and a nominal whiteness, between insider, outsider, and a murky middle ground. None of these non-Black minority groups move more frequently or more dramatically than Japanese Americans, thanks to their supposed ties to America's arch enemy in the Pacific. In fact, racist assumptions about those ties sometimes led to exclusions of Japanese Americans alone. So that would be evidence, in my view, of a Japanese, non-Japanese line. So for example, the Navy throughout World War II never accepted Japanese American enlistment. They excluded Japanese Americans throughout the war. And so this is a Japanese, non-Japanese line because Japanese Americans are excluded and all other able-bodied men are not. So overall, the military's complex of color lines constituted not simply a structure of white supremacy, but it was also a structure of Black subordination and often Japanese American and other non-white subordination too. Now, when you hear the word structure, you might think that this is kind of static or inevitable, but I want to insist that there was nothing static or inevitable about these arrangements. Some color lines originated during World War II in direct response to its twists and turns. But even those lines that long preceded World War II, especially Black-white lines, had to be recreated affirmatively and continually throughout the conflict. In time, the military's various color lines shifted. The white, non-white divide generally blurred over the course of the war. That is, it became less salient, less important. Often it blurred a fair amount, interestingly. To a lesser but nonetheless important extent, the Black-white divide did so as well, especially in the war's final year or so, and especially overseas. And I'm not going to be able to get too much into the blurring, but I'm happy to talk to you about it in the Q&A. So there are all these lines. Who built them? Who built them? Well, it was a group effort for sure. If some ordinary white people, both in and out of uniform, proved enthusiastic builders, more powerful architects had the most say in the matter, especially on the ground commanders and War and Navy Department leaders. With a few important exceptions, the White House, Congress, and the courts, including the Supreme Court, supported these leaders implicitly or explicitly all along the way. One seeming exception, and a really important one, is the 1940 Selective Training and Service Act, which contained this straightforward and sweeping civil rights clause. Quote, "In the selection and training of men under this act, and in the interpretation and the execution of this provision, there shall be no discrimination against any person on account of race or color," end of quote. That's the letter of the law passed by the US Congress in 1940, signed by FDR in 1940. Had the military followed the letter of the law, or had the White House or the courts forced it to do so, America's World War II armed forces would have been infinitely more egalitarian. But virtually no one in the federal government showed any interest in enforcing this law. So who built these many different color lines? Mainly military leaders and the civilian leaders above them, but Congress, the president, and the courts were involved as well, either in active or in passive ways. So why? Why these color lines exactly? You might think in total war that the US military had more important things to worry about than building these extensive color lines. Well, there was one primary, inescapable, paradoxical reason for these color lines, and that is, in the leaders' minds, in the minds of leaders, especially military leaders, winning the war for freedoms required unfreedoms. Winning the war for freedoms required unfreedoms. Leaders claimed repeatedly, for example, that the morale, efficiency, and discipline of US troops, by which they almost always meant white US troops, demanded Black-white color lines. The implication here was that whites would otherwise be too consumed by anti-Black resentments and conflict to invest their all in the war effort. The Black-white divide from this perspective was a wartime imperative, a precondition for victory. The argument was a damning admission about the depths of the nation's anti-Black racism. And it also painted a picture of the wartime military that contrasts sharply with popular notions of unity. But truthfully, the Black-white divide had more to do with leaders' own deep investments in white domination and Black subordination. Both, they seem to believe in their bones, were natural, essential, and virtuous features of American life. So when the military itself proved at times to threaten these features, no matter how unwittingly, leaders redoubled their efforts to shore these color lines up. Towards war's end, this white supremacist consensus showed cracks among some military leaders, especially in the Navy, as it turns out, but other leaders clung to this consensus, this white supremacist consensus, tenaciously through victory and beyond. Now, I mentioned, so that's why the Black-white line in particular. What about some of these other lines? The white, non-white, and Japanese, non-Japanese divides stemmed in part from their own particular logics. At times, military leaders also viewed them as essential to the war effort, none more so than when Japanese Americans and issues of national security were concerned. At other times, however, these leaders also viewed stark white, non-white, and Japanese, non-Japanese divides as war effort liabilities, as something that actually would hurt the war effort. Leaders felt these lines could damage America's ties to its so-called darker allies abroad, and they feared that these lines confirmed Axis propagandists' claims about the United States race war for white supremacy. Of course, Black activists and their allies made these very same points about the Black-white divide, but to little avail. Nearly all of America's military brass viewed bright Black-white lines as an undisputed war imperative. By contrast, the value of white, non-white, and Japanese, non-Japanese lines was more contingent, varying somewhat depending on the time, the context, and the people in question. So that's racism, part one. Part two, resistance. These efforts to draw color lines are only half the story. After all, the military's purpose in building these lines was often defensive. It often sought to shore these lines up against Black people and Black people's and others' constant efforts to rewrite or remove these lines. Furthermore, to the extent that these boundaries shifted or blurred, became less important over the course of the war, bottom-up struggles deserve a good deal of credit. And yet, we don't have a good understanding, it seems to me, of the role of the military and especially troops themselves in civil rights histories. Wide-ranging battles against military racism constituted a vital chapter in the broader story of modern America's freedom struggles. So these struggles were plural. Just as there were distinct color lines wending their way throughout the military, distinct movements arose in response. The largest of these movements involved Black troops and an impressive array of allies, including Black newspapers, civil rights organizations, labor unions, religious groups, and troops' families and loved ones. And some of the slides give you a little bit of a sense of some of the people who were allying themselves with service members who were trying to make the military more egalitarian during the war. The troops themselves tended to focus on racism, most common in their day-to-day lives in uniform. So things like rank and promotions and jobs and recreation. Their allies supported them in these battles, but they also took the lead on broader policy fights about equal access to the military and its desegregation. Black activists and their supporters employed the broadest range of protest styles and tactics, including heroic soldiering, letter writing, petitions, lobbying, voting, litigation, boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and armed self-defense. So when you think of a lot of these tactics as being kind of signature elements of the post-war civil rights movement, you'd be right, but some of this got their start, I would say, in the military during the war itself. African Americans tried their best as soldiers, hoping that heroic service in uniform might finally secure for them some semblance of fairness and decency and respect. And some tried their least in uniform, convinced that no amount of sacrifice would uproot Jim Crow. So one of my favorite examples of an African-American soldier activist is Winfred Linn. And so I showed you a picture of him earlier. So Winfred Linn was once a household name in some circles in World War II America. He was a national civil rights group bore his name. Newspapers sang his praises. Pamphlets and radio shows told his story. Cocktail parties raised money for his cause. He was a 36-year-old black landscape gardener from Queens, New York. Linn refused to be drafted into the segregated US Army in 1942. He said he would be drafted into an integrated army, but he refused to serve in a segregated army. But when he was told that, well, actually, if you want to fight these fights, you have to actually join the army. So he did so reluctantly. And he rose to the rank of sergeant, serving in a medical sanitary company in the Pacific. But he continued his battle against military racism in uniform. He helped organize sit-down strikes. He circulated protest petitions among fellow troops and served as the plaintiff in a civil rights case that reached the US Supreme Court in 1944. A decade before Brown v. Board of Education, his case challenged state-sanctioned racial segregation in the Army and in the Selective Service. Now, he lost his case, but his activism, in my view, contributed to the post-war desegregation of the military and to the Black civil rights movement after the war. So that's Winfred Linn. My son was asked to do a Black History Month, choose a figure for Black History Month in his elementary school, and he's doing Winfred Linn, which I'm very excited to announce. So he had to look at some of my book for information. So that's in a very small nutshell, African-American soldier activists and their allies, facing their own set of military color lines involving things like bars on their enlistment, segregation and surveillance. Japanese Americans and their allies also fought to resist and rewrite these lines. Most famously, this involved highly decorated military service in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion, but there were other forms of advocacy and activism as well. A small subset of Japanese Americans also made their compliance with induction conditional on their receiving compensation, that is reparations for the wrongs of internment during World War II, or mass removal and mass incarceration. Some Japanese Americans also fought both voluntary enlistment and compulsory conscription, demanded repatriation and expatriation, and renounced their US citizenship. More examples of that in a bit. There were also miscellaneous struggles or moments of struggle in the wartime military. Perhaps the most important of these, and I have a whole chapter about this, involved an assorted collection of inductees whose official racial designation was the subject of enormous debate between the military and the men themselves. In many of these cases, the men who identified, say, as Indian or Puerto Rican or Moorish American or Creole, many of these men fought most fervently to be not Black, since it was that category that faced, or the people that were forced to live within that category, who faced the most expansive and debilitating forms of military racism. This point reminds us that the point that some of this activism involved people just not wanting to be defined as Black. This point reminds us that these struggles against military racism were as varied as the racism itself. Some people wish to keep color lines more or less in place, but simply to relocate themselves or their fellows in relation to those lines. Others wish to blur some color lines, but not all color lines. And then, of course, others fought to eliminate all color lines, all forms of racism altogether. Third part, aftermaths. So I've kind of given you the kind of two broad themes of the book, racism and what it looks like in various parts of the military, resistance, what that looks like. Now I want to conclude with a brief discussion of what the overall impact of this complicated story of racism and resistance was. The call and response of military racism and resistance cast a long and complex shadow over post-war American life. And so I'm going to talk about what I see as the kind of positive effects of these stories and the negative effects. I'll start with positive, I'll end with the negative, and sadly, the negative, I think, are far more significant, although the positive are important as well. So on the positive side, countless returning veterans infused civilian civil rights struggles already swelling in power in the Depression and World War II years. They infused these struggles with enormous energy and moral authority. The war years had profoundly changed many Black GIs. For example, they donned the official uniform of the US military. They traveled the world and they traveled the United States. They met new people. They learned new skills. They thrilled to new freedoms and they protested against old injustices. And in the process, they became ever more convinced that America could and must change. They were told their entire lives that racism was just a fact of life, and it just, you had to kind of live with it. And many of these service members are realizing that was absolutely ridiculous. Crossing the Pacific on a troop transport in late December 1945, one African-American soldier later recalled predicting about his fellow Black veterans, quote, "When the moment came, and it would come, these men were going to be the cutting edge of a movement that would change America." Well, that moment arrived sooner than he and others might have expected. All over the country, many Black veterans quickly became indispensable leaders, organizers, and foot soldiers in surging post-war civil rights struggles. Whether their names are familiar, say Medgar Evers, or less familiar, say Welton Taylor or Winfred Lynn, they marched to courthouses across the South to register to vote. They organized chapters of the NAACP. They lobbied governments for fair employment and fair housing laws. They became litigants in numerous civil rights cases. They joined or launched local efforts to desegregate schools and pools, apartment complexes, and movie theaters. They unionized their workplaces, and in the 50s and 60s, they cultivated a whole new generation of civil rights activists. A similar sort of political awakening occurred with non-Black minority troops as well, and for some of the same reasons. The wartime chance to represent the United States, to travel, to meet new people, to learn new skills. But in contrast to Black veterans, many Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Latin Americans enjoyed greater freedoms in the military than they had ever outside it, an experience that also politicized them in new and profound ways. Writing of Japanese American soldiers from Hawaii, for example, historian Franklin Odo argued that, quote, race relations could never be the same after on the mainland and in Europe, they bought sex from white prostitutes, fed white beggars, fraternized and brawled with white GIs, married white women, and killed white enemies, end of quote. Similarly, for Native American veterans, according to several scholars, quote, the inclusion that they found in the armed forces and the racial equality reinforced a desire for self-determination, equal treatment, or some combination of the two. Much like African Americans, a mix of non-Black minority veterans also spearheaded post-war freedom struggles of various sorts. Native American ex-GIs, for example, became active in tribal governments and through spirited activism quickly won the right to vote in New Mexico and Arizona. They eliminated liquor prohibitions on reservation Indians and demanded greater access to GI Bill benefits. Japanese American veterans traded on their newfound status as war heroes to battle discriminatory veterans organizations, employers, and alien land and naturalization laws, and to gain a modicum of redress for wartime internment. Mexican-American veterans similarly returned fighting. Military experiences convinced some white veterans to join these struggles as well. For some, it was the act of traveling to and witnessing other less rigidly racist societies, or fighting alongside so-called colored minorities, or rehabilitating with them in adjacent hospital beds, or witnessing firsthand the ways that, quote, blood and death respected no man because of color, end of quote. For others, it was the evils of Nazi racism, or the larger democratic and anti-racist rhetoric of the war effort, or it was encounters with that other military caste regime that divided officer from enlisted personnel, which convinced them to oppose, quote, any system which grants unearned privileges to a particular class of individuals, end of quote. Whatever the precise causes, some segment of white veterans returned home with a deepened or newfound determination to build a more egalitarian post-war America. New veterans organizations, such as the American Veterans of World War II and the American Veterans Committee, formed in part because, quote, artificial barriers against our fellow men are crumbling under the impact of war. Bullets do not distinguish between color, race, or creed, end of quote. Other white veterans organized brotherhood days, weeks, and months, advocated for fair employment laws, spoke out against housing discrimination, and demanded a desegregated military and a desegregated National Guard. Thanks to sweeping wartime activism, the US military also became more egalitarian during the war. By war's end, in direct contrast to its beginning, no military service excluded any group on the basis of race, and the practice of racist segregation in military units and elsewhere was well on its way out in the case of Japanese Americans and other non-Black minority groups, and it was newly controversial in the case of African Americans. Indeed, President Truman often receives the lion's share of credit for the post-war desegregation of the US military, but wartime activists in and out of uniform, especially Black activists like Winfred Lynn, deserve their fair share. I would argue, and I think if you read the book, I hope you come away with this newfound understanding of just how expansive civil rights activism was, especially in the military and around military issues. And I think it absolutely laid the foundation for the desegregation of the military in 1948, or at least the beginning of desegregation in 1948. So these were all important advances, and we should celebrate them. And I think to some extent we do. I feel like we kind of know some of these stories. But the negative side of the ledger is longer and more significant, sadly. So I'm going to mention a few things here. So first, military color lines produced unspeakable suffering and humiliation, which haunted some veterans long after the end of the war, if it did not kill them first. Distinguished historian John Hope Franklin recalled that, quote, his older brother, a college graduate and high school principal, was abused by his white uneducated staff sergeant, consigned to the kitchen brigade, and driven to an early grave 2 years after the close of the war by the insensitive, barbaric treatment of those who draped themselves in the flag and sang the national anthem, even as they destroyed the nation's ideals and its people, end of quote. Even many of those who survived still face serious challenges even decades later. Interviewed in the 1970s, one Black veteran recalled, quote, there are thousands of Black ex-GIs who will not talk about World War II because for the Black man, it was humiliating, degrading, cruel, and not by accident. The treatment of the Black was deliberate, contrived, and planned, as well as the Normandy invasion. Only the invasion is over, but the wounds of the Black are still raw, end of quote. My grandfather-in-law's story, war story, suggests that these lasting wounds were not Black veterans alone. So I showed you a picture of Yasugo Kodomia. So Yasugo Kodomia, again, my wife's grandfather, born on Bainbridge Island in Washington State, joined the Army on his 26th birthday, January 13th, 1942. What his experiences were like in uniform are largely unknown, except that on August 7th, 1943, he and 5 other Japanese American soldiers stationed in Wyoming wrote to the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson. They wished to renounce their US citizenship and expatriate to Japan. When the Army investigated the men's requests, Kodomia explained that, quote, on several occasions in the US Army, I have been referred by officers as a goddamn Jap. An officer once told me that it is a disgrace to the United States to permit a Jap to wear a uniform, end of quote. No doubt the other restrictions placed on Japanese American soldiers at the time, their mandatory movement inland, their constant surveillance, their loss of arms and so forth, no doubt these other restrictions infuriated this willful, proud, and principled young man. In any case, the Army rejected his and the other requests for expatriation, but punished him and the others just the same. It transferred him to a hard labor battalion for the potentially subversive. It forced him to conduct menial tasks for the rest of the war, and it eventually discharged him less than honorably, which restricted his access to invaluable GI Bill benefits, just as he was getting married and starting a family. When he died of alcoholism at the age of 58, he had not been well for years. His embittering, if not downright traumatizing Army experiences had to have played a role. Second, so the first point about the kind of the negative consequences of the stories I'm telling is just the trauma and humiliation and suffering that many soldiers of color were forced to endure. The second point, the military's racist lines unquestionably interfered with its efficient execution of the war, perhaps lengthening America's time in the conflict and costing American lives. Now, this is something you do not hear a lot about. Now, to be clear, military leaders and civil rights activists hotly debated throughout the war whether color lines helped or hurt the Allies' chances against the Axis. Settling the matter definitively, of course, is completely impossible since the effects of a more egalitarian armed forces in this period will never be known. What seems indisputable, however, is that military color lines came with few benefits and considerable costs. For example, the military's restrictions against African American and Japanese American enlistment or against their and other non-whites promotions and commissions robbed it of more than 500,000 service members and untold numbers of people who, had they been given the chance, would have excelled as, say, pilots or paratroopers or generals. Moreover, while military leadership often claimed that color lines minimized inefficiencies and strife, they often maximized both. How? In the form of added administrative work required to run multiple militaries, in the form of the overuse and underuse of facilities, equipment, and people as a consequence of the same, in the form of countless disturbances and protests to dissolve or deepen military racism, and in the form of lowered morale among many of those troops ensnared, enraged, and dispirited by that racism. So that's number two. It hurt the war effort. 3, in drawing these color lines, the military made and remade the very idea of race, deepening belief in its taken for granted reality. One might be tempted to discount the importance of this naturalization process, or the process by which people come to believe that things like races are natural rather than man-made. One might be tempted to discount the importance of this naturalization process, given that the concept of race had been around by the war years for at least 2 centuries in the United States and of course beyond. But all racist regimes, less stable than they appear, require the constant making and remaking of race to live on. America's World War II military, 16 million people strong, some 11% of the US population at the time. The US military was among the nation's most important and bustling factories in this broader war production process, this war production of race process. Along with the US's colossal munitions industry then, one might consider race as the country's other great wartime destructive creation. 4th point, military racism deepened many whites' investment in white supremacy, especially its anti-Black variant. For every white veteran who returned home with a burning desire to redraw or remove America's color lines, and I said there were many of them, for every one of those kind of veterans who came home wanting desperately to democratize the US, there was another, likely several, every bit as determined to protect color lines at all costs, especially again, those involving African Americans. The most extensive Army survey of soldiers and veterans' views found that while some whites, quote, felt that tolerance had been promoted by interracial contact in the Army, a larger group seemed to have reinforced their prejudiced pre-Army attitudes, end of quote. One representative veteran, recalling his time in the service, remarked that relations with Black GIs were fine, quote, as long as they stayed in their place. We didn't associate with each other. They kept on the other side of the line, end of quote. 5th, that this line was actually plural, not singular, that the military imposed not one color line, but a bewildering mix of them, may have poisoned or further poisoned America's post-war politics for years to come. A War Department intelligence report from 1942 remarked, quote, in India, the British have instituted as many as 5 or 6 grades of Jim Crow. The reason for this being that the British found that the more classes there are, the easier it is to exploit the masses. This is a military intelligence report from India in 1942. In other words, divide and conquer. Something similar happened in America's World War II military, though save the crystal clear intentionality. The military's many, quote, grades of Jim Crow and their many racialized classes greatly complicated the efforts of individual Americans and groups of them to cooperate in post-war America, to build bridges across these stark color divides. This point is especially noteworthy given that there were numerous promising efforts during the Great Depression and World War II to cooperate across color lines. Coalescing around an eclectic mix of expansive identities, from workers to, quote, darker races to simply the people, a diverse mix of leftists, unionists, feminists, and civil rights activists organized and mobilized from Hawaii to Memphis, Los Angeles to Newark, Winston-Salem to Detroit. They came together to fight fascism and imperialism, to advance civil rights and workers' rights, and to imagine a new, more just world. But such expansive solidarity appeared only intermittently in the military, and it often foundered in post-war civilian circles for numerous reasons. But one important reason is too often, in my view, overlooked, and that is the deep and convoluted color lines embedded in every aspect of millions of Americans' military lives, and the enduring fractures those lines produced. And keep in mind that many of these soldiers are in their early 20s, very impressionable, spending 2, 3, 4 years in service. This was an incredibly formative experience for them. Finally, final point. Lost in this fracturing was a simple but profound truth. Military racism spared no one. Divisions. The book catalogs the manifold harms done to African Americans and Japanese Americans, and to a lesser extent, other non-white people. These harms endured in the form of skills not learned, promotions not won, wages not earned, wealth not accumulated, experience not gained, GI Bill benefits not received, mass movements not waged, and psychological traumas not resolved. But even white people, by far the biggest beneficiaries of the military's color lines, also paid a price, sometimes the ultimate price. Racist barriers in enlistment and elsewhere ensured whites' overrepresentation among those who served, fought on the front lines, and died in World War II. Viewed this way, military racism crowned few true victors. So it has been with all forms of racism, past and present. Thanks very much.
Tom, thank you very much. We're so glad you were able to spend time with us and summarize just the key points of the book, but there's so much more to it in the detail. So I hope folks get a chance to pick that up. But thank you for spending time with us. Let me go to some questions. Looks like we have a lot. We'll get to as many as we can. One of our audience members writes, "It's my understanding that a very serious shortage of frontline infantrymen in the European theater starting in the fall of '44 forced the US Army to place all Black platoons and companies into all white battalions. How well did these initial integration efforts work? And did they positively impress Army leaders to push for integration after World War II?"
That's a great question, and you're absolutely right. That is what happened in late '44 and early '45. There was an experiment, very unusual experiment. They actually brought in Black troops and integrated white units with these Black troops. They fought together, and the Army actually extensively studied these units because they had been telling themselves for years and years that this was an absolute impossibility. White soldiers and Black soldiers would never get along if they were to serve in the same unit. And so that's why they were so committed to segregation. And yet what their own studies showed over and over and over again is that actually the opposite was the case. That when white and Black soldiers were placed into battle together and they served in some of the same units, all of these kind of boundaries just completely broke away. And so they have interview after interview with many white soldiers who admitted that they were not interested in this experiment when it started. They never expected it to work, but it in fact did work. What's sad though about this story, because you asked, did this make a favorable impression on Army leaders? You know, they buried the report for a while because it's so profoundly undermined their working assumptions about the importance of segregation. And so they did not, they didn't trumpet this story. And it's a wonderful story. There's a book by John, I believe his name is John Collier. It's a book that came out about 10 years ago and focuses on this very experiment. So if you're wanting to know more about it, I recommend that book. But great question.
Okay, another question is, were USO clubs segregated by race or other factors?
Yes, they were. I mean, so one of the things that I think is really important to understand is just how complex this was. It wasn't like that, in certain respects, like segregation by unit, these were decisions made at the top levels of military leadership. But things like USOs and posts and bases and that sort of thing, recreation centers, post exchanges, bowling alleys, cafeterias, whatever. So often these decisions about integration and segregation were made at the local level. Local commanders made those decisions. And so there was some variation, but generally speaking, there was segregation in so many of these places, north and south, and all around the world. And that's the case with the USO as well. I'm not going to, but I would imagine there was definitely, again, variation there too. And when I say segregation, it primarily involved African-American troops, but I can think of at least a few instances. There was many Japanese American troops trained at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. And there was a special USO club that was opened in Hattiesburg, Mississippi called the Aloha Club. And, you know, it was open primarily for Japanese American soldiers, but interestingly, and this is a real contrast, you know, whereas so many Army leaders committed themselves to protecting Black-white segregation, they sometimes did the opposite when it came to Japanese Americans. And we can get into reasons for that in a bit. But in any case, when this Aloha USO Club opened, the commander at Camp Shelby met with local leaders and said, you know, we want to just make sure that yes, it's great to open a club that's kind of geared more towards Japanese Americans and folks from Hawaii. Many Japanese American soldiers at that time were from Hawaii. It's okay, but we want to make sure that this doesn't preclude them from using some of these white USO clubs. And they said, yes, that's fine. But in any case, so it's a good question. I'm sure there was variation, but there was also quite a bit of segregation, particularly with regard to African American troops.
So let me combine two questions that are kind of similar. To what extent was it whites from the South who grew up with Jim Crow responsible for the creation of the black-white line? Or was this something that was across the country?
Yeah, I mean, this was a national story. Now, it's true there are kind of regional elements without question. So by far the largest number of Army camps during the war, posts, training stations, installations were in the South. And so part of, you know, sometimes military leaders kind of justified segregation or justified the implementation of a black-white line by saying, well, we have to kind of abide by local customs. But it happened in the North as well. And it often, you know, military leaders often brought it to Northern communities for the first time, you know, and they also brought it all around the world, sometimes for the first time. Now, was that because some of these military leaders were Southern? Absolutely. And that's a story you hear quite a bit. You know, honestly, I was never able to get a kind of a precise breakdown on, you know, it's kind of more anecdotal that, you know, Southerners tended to predominate in the officer ranks, for example. I never saw an actual breakdown, but there was an element of that, but it was just much, much broader. It was far beyond Southern troops and Southern officers who were responsible for the implementation of black-white lines. And I'll just give you one other example. Henry Louis Stimson, you know, the Secretary of War throughout World War II, was from the North, and he was every bit as committed to black-white segregation, the black-white line in these, you know, many places. He was as committed as anyone else.
All right, Tom, another question. Where did FDR fall into this story? What was his position on this? Those who have read and written on FDR usually say he straddled the line almost all the time and without being a moderate, but where did he line up in your story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so you'll have to, I hope you'll read the book and you'll see kind of the details, but I'll just say kind of generally speaking, you know, he's caught in a very difficult position in that there's rising electoral power on the left among African Americans and among many of their allies. So there's increasing political incentive on the part there's increasing need on the part of FDR to speak to those folks. On the other hand, Southern Democrats are a core part of the Democratic Party at this time. As many people have said, Ira Katz-Nelson has written extensively about this. The Congress was a Southern cage. Southern Democrats dominated so many of the committees in Congress, many of the committees that provided resources to the military. And so FDR was very careful not to antagonize Southern Democrats by too openly supporting black civil rights causes. So he's kind of caught in the middle, but the bottom line is there's no evidence that he's ever kind of personally invested in black civil rights, honestly. Every now and then he kind of throws a bone to civil rights activists and African-American communities right around election time, usually. So in 1940, for example, he meets with Black leaders and he says, you know, they're asking him to kind of integrate the military and to reduce discrimination and to open up all branches of the military to African Americans, and among other things, to promote more African Americans into the officer ranks and so forth. And, you know, he's not really willing to, well, he commits to allowing African Americans to be kind of proportionally represented in the Army, but he's completely unwilling to do anything about segregation, among many of the other kind of racist lines in the military. And there are other moments when, again, around election time in 44, when he makes small adjustments. I mean, I think the best thing he did is that he really forced the Navy to take many, many more African Americans. They were really only accepting African Americans in the most menial positions throughout the war. Early in the war. But he forces the Navy in April of 1942 to change that policy and to take more African Americans in and to spread them across the Navy to some extent, not concentrate them in the kind of lowest status positions.
Were Black World War II veterans excluded from the 1950s era Housing and Education Assistance Acts for veterans?
Yeah, that's another great question. It really varied, you know. So there were Black veterans that were able to get some of those wonderful benefits, but African Americans were disproportionately restricted from that access for a variety of reasons. So one reason is that if you read the book, you'll understand that, or I hope you'll come to understand that the military, the criminal justice system in the military was just you know, so racist in so many different ways. And what that did was it produced a disproportionately large number of dishonorable discharges or other than honorable discharges, some kind of discharge that would restrict your access to GI Bill benefits. So that's one way in which they were restricted. Another way they were restricted was they were kept out of the military. So the first chapter of this book is about the kind of the longstanding committed campaign to restrict African-American enlistment in the military. It's a complicated story. It's an ever-changing story. But the bottom line is, you know, the US government, FDR, the War Department promised that African-Americans would be proportionally represented. They were never proportionally represented. And so because they're being restricted from access to the military, that ultimately means down the road, they're restricted from access to the GI Bill. The final way that they were restricted was that many of these GI Bill benefits were distributed locally. And this gets back to the Southern cage point that I made earlier, right? So the GI Bill, Southern Democrats controlled Congress. If the GI Bill was going to get passed, they were going to want to control the distribution of many of these resources because they understood that their whole kind of class and race regime in the South was dependent upon kind of exploitable and deeply vulnerable African-American population. If that population has access to business loans and, you know, vocational training or college degrees or advanced degrees, that might seriously be threatened. And so what they were able to do is they built into the GI Bill certain clauses that in effect greatly restricted African Americans' access to the GI Bill. So did they gain access? Yes, they did, but not on the level that they should have and they deserved.
Well, folks, we're going to have to end the questions there. Thanks to our audience for tuning in and asking great questions. And of course, thanks to Professor Thomas Guglielmo, who joined us tonight and spent time with us on his great new book, Divisions. We really appreciate you being with us tonight and having you for this program.
Well, thanks so much, John, for having me. And thanks again to everybody for tuning in. I really appreciate it.
Great. Okay, have a good evening, everybody, and see you next time and on our book talk or battle briefs. And thanks for coming.